Hello, in this video we're going to look at how to create dynamic icons from skeletal meshes. So part of my inventory system, I basically got a bunch of skeletal meshes from some asset packs and stuff, and I wanted to populate them in my inventory. So I didn't have 2D assets for them, and I didn't want to use some random ones. So I decided to try and make a little widget to essentially try and draw them. And here's a blog post that covers step by step how I've achieved it. And what I'm going to do is I'm also going to show you a demo of what it looks like before I begin, just for you to get a feel of do you want to do this or not? Does it sort of align with your requirements? So here's my inventory system. So you'll be able to see a bunch of the items over here. And all of these icons are essentially dynamically created from skeletal meshes. So if I click to drop them, you can see there's my axe, there's some sort of a staff there, a sword, another staff, etc. So you can see that all of these items are of varying dimensions. So some are taller, some are shorter, and yeah, they just have different properties. But my 2D icons, they're sort of trying to centralize them, and they all appear to be pretty good, I think, right? Like, I mean, it's not perfect, I think a custom-made 2D icon is better, but certainly this is a bit more scalable for me. If I have 30, 40 different meshes, I don't want to be creating those 2D assets myself, as I'm not really an artist. So this is what I'm making, and behind it, the technology is very similar to the one that's basically rendering this character. And so I've basically taken this tutorial to achieve that, which was really useful. So feel free to check this out. I would recommend it because the method that I'm sharing here is pretty much based on this, but I've had to make a bunch of modifications to blueprints to make it more dynamic. So here, for instance, you just have the one instance, and I was basically having issues with making this dynamic. So you can see all of these items are populated runtime, right? So if I pick up an item, I'm creating a new instance of this 2D image. So I'll be showing you how I've managed to get that to work. Okay, so in general, you're after making 4 files. So one of them is this 3D mesh capture blueprint. The other one is the render target. And the last one here is material. From the material, you're able to generate an image for the widget. Okay, so I'll go through them step by step, what they do. So I'll begin with this one, which is the 3D mesh capture blueprint. It looks most useful inside the viewport. So this is what it is that we're basically working with. Okay, you effectively have a skeletal mesh and a camera. So the camera is taking a picture of the skeletal mesh, and you're going to try and do something cool with that, right? Like convert it to a 2D logo. So that's what we were trying to do. So at the moment, this looks quite centralized. So what I'll show you is, so it's doing that because my item mesh over here is set to a default value. So if I clear this, you'll see that this looks a bit broken right now. And I'm setting this dynamically. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just disable this for a second, and you'll be able to see what it would look like if the construction script wasn't running. So you can see this is not really fully central and stuff. So I'll go through this step by step, and I'll show you how we're getting things to work. Okay, so the first step of the construction script is to show only actor components. So this is taking the scene capture component 2D, so this camera component over there, and it's saying that just capture this skeletal mesh. Don't grab any of the surroundings, right? So don't get any of the background. This is important because we're going to be spawning this item 3D mesh capture blueprint into the game world, and we don't want it to be capturing any of the background there, right? So that's why this piece is quite important. Next, we're going to be setting the skeletal mesh, right? So I've basically put this to be a static one, but ultimately we want this to be dynamic. So you'll be telling what the skeletal mesh is for us to draw. So this is setting the skeletal mesh dynamically. And we get this through a constructor. So you can see that this is a public variable, and we've also set expose on spawn, which allows us to essentially set this from another blueprint which creates this one. Okay, so that's what makes this feature dynamic. Next, we want to reposition the skeletal mesh to make it more center. Okay, so like I say here, if we look at this picture right now, you know, the sword doesn't look in the center, right? Because like the center point is basically right there. So if I change the skeletal mesh to something else, so let's go for a staff, for example. Okay, this looks a lot more center, right? We expect the center point here to be the middle of the mesh. If we go for something like an axe, again, it looks a little bit out of center. So if I just connect this, which will also set the skeletal mesh, let's recompile it. And I'm going to set this to an axe. Okay, you can see this looks a lot better, right? So it's basically centralized for the camera view. So how do we do that? We basically get the skeletal mesh and we get the component bounds. And from the component bounds, we get this origin component. This gives us the location of the center from the skeletal mesh. So by default, essentially for whatever reason, it doesn't really put the skeletal mesh right at the center of the spawn point, essentially, right? So we will essentially reposition the skeletal mesh based on this origin point. So we care about the x and the z coordinates, so basically the height and the horizontal one, so vertical and horizontal axes. So we don't care about the depth, right? It's not going to be moving in that axis. But we do care about, like say, the vertical and the horizontal one. So that's what we're going to be subtracting. Bear in mind though that these 0 coordinates here, they can change, right? So they're taken from the real world, so the game world position. And what happens is, I'll give you a sneak preview. So this is where we spawn this item 3D mesh capture blueprint, right? And the transform here is 0 and then some value and 0. So I specifically made it 0 now on these two, so that it's easier for me to do the subtraction here. Now, they can actually probably be just made as variables as well, and maybe I can dynamically pull them as well. But for the sake of simplicity, this is fine now, and it actually works pretty well. So there we have this. So this is how we reposition the skeletal mesh to become in the center of the field of view. And the last thing that we want to do is also alter the arm length of the spring arm. So this is pretty much a optional component. You don't really need it because you can just reposition the camera instead. But it's nice to have, right? So it's easy to basically work with it, right? And what we want to do is the camera is set to this field of view of 30. And there are some field of view calculators and stuff that you can use, though I didn't really find one that seemed to work for me. So I went through a bit of trial and error, but it's always proportional, right? So if you have a static field of view and your distance of the camera is proportional to how much you can see, right? So what I've done here is that I've just multiplied the height of the object by 3.7, and that gave me my arm length that I wanted the camera to be away from the object. So again, I get my skeletal mesh, I get the box extent. So this gives me the dimensions of the box, right? And I specifically cared about the height dimension. So I multiplied the height by 3.7, and that gave me the arm length to use. So again, I'll sort of show you how it looks like. And you can vary these parameters to your requirements. So 3.7 looks pretty good to me. If I make it much smaller, this means that the distance of the camera becomes shorter. So let's say I put it to 1.5. This will be really zoomed in, right? So I'm going to be chopping some of my items off, right? So this is too much. And likewise, if I put this to 5, I'm going to be quite zoomed out. So some people might want this, to be honest, right? You might want to have a smaller icon in here. So that's cool as well. For me, you know, 3.6, 3.7, this works quite well. I think this fits in really nicely, and it seems to work. So you can play around with these parameters to your requirements. And this essentially completes the first component, the item 3D mesh capture blueprint. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to be doing is basically looking at the render target. So once you've created this, you want to link this scene capture component 2D to the texture target, right? So you just link this texture target. There's nothing else. Oh yeah, there is one thing that you'll want to change. So just make these size X and Y parameters, I would say, as small as you need them, right? So you don't need to make them too large. If, for example, my components here, they're only 80 by 80 pixels. So that's why I set this size X and Y to 80 by 80 as well, okay? Once you've got this target configured, so once it's all there, you can then create your material. So this is following the same steps as in the other video, but what you're also going to need to do is parameterize this this field. So I believe it's called texture sample or something, right? So texture sample. So this is what you're going to be having, and what you're going to do is right click it and convert to parameter. Once you've done that, give it a cool name. I gave mine item texture, and that way we're going to be able to create material instances and override the item texture that we're going to be using. So that's part of making this whole thing dynamic. Okay, so I can remove this as well, but this is how the material will look like. And once you've got this set up, you can then start importing this into the widget itself. So if I go into the designer view, there's my axe basically, right? So before I do that, I think, so I've connected this. Yeah, this looks good. So I'm not entirely sure why this looks a bit funny. Sometimes it takes a while for it to, yeah, it seems to be fine. Okay, I think it's fixing itself now. Yeah, sometimes it takes a little while for it to sort itself out, but it looks good now. So this is our widget, which basically contains the 2D logo that you want, essentially, right? So as a bonus, I suppose I can show you my widget, which also uses it. So it should be around here, widgets. So there's my styled inventory slot, right? So this is using this item rotating widget. I'm actually going to try and make this a rotating one as well, so where the item will be spinning. So I think that would be a cool addition, but it's certainly not required, right? Okay, so this is the widget, and I can show you the blueprints behind it as well. Okay, so basically I've created a new custom event. It's called update mesh. So you can create a custom event by typing that and just giving it some name, right? So once you've created the custom event, this part is sort of optional. So I'm going to try and make this a spinning icon. So you don't need this for this part, but you're definitely going to need to spawn the 3D mesh capture blueprint, but you don't need to set the character as the owner. I think later on I'm going to be doing some interaction with it, so that's why I added the owner here, but like I say, this is optional for you right now. So we spawn the item 3D mesh capture blueprint. So why do we need to do this? Like I say, this is going to be a dynamic capture blueprint, so I'm going to want to have multiple icons displayed at the same time. So we're going to need to create multiple instances of these blueprints, right? So if, for example, I want to display a sword, I need to create a new actor which has the sword as the mesh, and I'm going to be taking a picture of it and using that. If I've got an axe, I'm also going to spawn a new axe component as well. So that's why it's dynamic. The location I don't need to modify. And remember, the reason why they're not sort of interacting with each other, the reason why they're not sort of conflicting is because of this component over here. So that's what allows that. So that's why we have a static location. And here we set the item skeletal mesh. So when you spawn the item 3D mesh capture blueprint, like I say, this variable over here, this is exposed on spawn. So this is what allows us to essentially add this skeletal mesh over here. This is where you would feed in your own skeletal mesh to this component. So once we've spawned it, we set it to be visible in the scene capture only. So then we set the 3D mesh capture, so the one that we've created here. Okay, so the next thing is interesting. So create canvas render target 2D. So this thing over here, we're essentially now creating it dynamically. So to some extent you didn't need this, but to another you do, because you want to be creating this material, right? So it's really useful for you to have it, but we are actually creating this component completely dynamically over here, right? Another pro tip is, like I mentioned before, you should use the smallest values here. If you use some large ones, you could probably incur some lag, and it'll be pretty difficult for you to spot where that lag is coming from in the future, right? So again, I'll show you, like, this is working completely fine right now, right? So everything seems good. If I make this sort of, let's say 1,000 by 1,000, or in fact, let's put it to 2,000, right? And I've got a relatively decent computer, right? So, but look how slow it's just become, right? Like super slow. And it'll be hard for you to identify some of these issues. Now, for example, if I'm going to set this to 500, it's probably not going to be too bad, right? Like, it's not too bad, but it's certainly a lot slower than it could be if I just set it to 80 by 80. So, you know, I would say really watch out for making this to be too large, because like I say, it will use up a lot of your processing power if you do. For small images, it's completely fine. Okay, so you've created the canvas, you've set it up. Now you have to create the material, right? So all of these three blueprints, you're now spawning them dynamically, right? So you're creating a dynamic material instance, and you have to set the parent to be the material that you've created there. And this is also why we needed to parameterize this this thing over there, because we're going to be updating it, right? So set texture parameter value, and we give it the item texture name, so that's the name here, and we give it the value. So the canvas target is what we've just created over there. Okay, so all of these things you're setting dynamically, and then you set the brush from material. So the target is the item image, and you give it the material instance. Okay, so what does that mean? Basically, this this item image over here, you can see on these properties over here, you can see there's a brush and the image, and in the image we set this material. Okay, that's again what we're doing, but dynamically, right? So set brush from material, the target is the item image, and the value or the material is the material instance over here. Okay, so it's essentially just right from there, and that's basically it, right? So like I say, as a bonus, this is how it looks like part of my inventory slot, so I can then start using this widget in my other widgets. And I suppose this one also, this one gets actually dynamically from my server that's running in the background. But what happens is that I get the item, and I essentially evaluate what the item should be. So doing some bunch of stuff there. Let's see. Was looking at the wrong part. Okay, so over here is basically when I create this item styled inventory slot, I get fed in an item component. So from my inventory system, there I get my item ID, and from item ID I then evaluate what skeletal mesh to draw, right? So I set the item skeletal mesh over here, and then I call the update mesh custom event that we've created. So this resolved from ID, we basically have a bunch of skeletal meshes over here. I feed in an ID, it evaluates one to use. So that's how I've done it. And obviously there's many other ways of doing it. You can statically induce it, dynamically evaluate it. It's up to you really. But that's basically it. There are some cool things you can do as well. Like I say, this is now working dynamically. So for instance, I've added a light source over here. And yeah, so this will update dynamically, right? So what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to show you. So at the moment it's set to 10,000. So again, I'll show you how it looks like right now. So you can see the image is nice and bright. If I set this to 1, you can see it will be a lot darker now, right? So you can see I didn't need to modify any like 2D files or anything. These images now are dynamically evaluated, so any updates are going to be globally updated, so that makes it really good for me. One thing I would mention about the light is this cast shadows. Just make sure you disable it because it will have no impact on anything else because we're not capturing background or anything. But it will slow down the performance. So if I click on this, I'm not sure if you notice it, like certainly if these images were larger, but this is definitely like slower, right? Like it's just slower. So there is no benefit to having this. So I'm setting the light intensity back, so you can see there's no shadows there. You don't really see any effect. So just make sure you disable this because it will slow your PC down for no good reason. And there we have it. So this is how you can generate your own 2D assets from skeletal meshes. So best of luck and see you next time. Bye.